Let's drop the charade and get down to business, shall we? Why are you here?
I'm the Revisor.
I'm sorry. Which?
The Revisor.
The Revisor. Oh, he's a shrewd one.
I'm Claudia Bauer, and we're here at the San Francisco Dance Film Festival for a conversation about the performance capture of Kid Pivott's wonderful Revisor, filmed at Sadler's Wells in London. Revisor was choreographed and co-created by Crystal Pite and Jonathon Young. And we are talking with Jonathon, who wrote the script, and with Tiffany Tregarthen, who performs the role of the Revisor. So Nikolai Gogol's 1836 play, The Government Inspector, called The Revisor in Russian, is a farce about government corruption and incompetence. Now that theme is always relevant, and the play has been performed and reinterpreted countless times. But Jonathon, what made you and Crystal decide to take it on at this point in time? And why did you feel it would lend itself to your unique kind of storytelling?
When we decided we were going to make another full-length work, right at the beginning, we sort of almost dared ourselves to try and record like a 5-act play and use some of the voiceover techniques that we used in the Tiffanys, and thought, what if we just do an entire 5-act thing or an entire play? And then we had been exploring the idea of farce when we were making the Tiffanys as a form, like as an extreme form of humor and physicality. And we had also touched on some sort of darker, more political stuff with a short we made called The Statement. And so we were thinking about bringing all that together. And for many years, I had been interested in doing something radical and strange with Gogol's play. Just always been in the back of my mind as an interesting structure. And so I just proposed it and told her loosely what I knew about the play, even though I wasn't terribly familiar with it. I've never seen a production of it, and couldn't remember when I had read it, if ever. But the premise felt archetypal, and it felt like an apparatus that would be interesting to explore as a dance theater piece.
Is there something about the fact that it is from 1836, it's almost 200 years old, that makes it more amenable to that kind of treatment, because it's so removed from the real specifics of the people involved, like that life doesn't exist anymore?
It was more to us that we felt like the premise of the imposter who tricks all these people and is then accepted into their world and then leaves, like that we had a feeling that the audience would catch on quickly to what was going to happen, and therefore we would be able to subvert those expectations. We were looking for a play like that we felt would feel archetypal to anyone who, even if they weren't familiar with Gogol's play, they would recognize the premise because it has been used and refracted and adapted so many times.
Mm-hmm. And when you and Crystal collaborate, the words and the movement carry really different but essential elements of the story. You couldn't really take one apart; the other one just wouldn't be as full. So how would you describe the role they play in this particular case? Like, you're talking about the movement itself as representing farce. Like, how do the words and movement work together?
I always think of the words as kind of a surface layer to the production. And when I was writing, I always imagined that the words kind of lived on their own in a kind of silence, detached from bodies, and that they needed bodies to dominate or control. They needed the physical figure to come to life and have any agency. And that meant that they were tied, like you said, and that there was also a problematic relationship there between language and physicality. There was conflict and oppression, maybe, and the potential for change. I mean, especially with the content that we explore in the play. Also, we left the middle section open, and I wrote the first few acts and then the last act, and we had a big kind of gulf, an empty hole when we started rehearsals, because we knew that the physicality needed to lead and to try to find a bridge, and that language would follow. So I wrote that stuff during rehearsals in response to what they were doing.
Mm-hmm. So then, Tiffany, for you, what was that creative process like?
There were sort of multiple layers to it. There's this element that John's describing where the language is an opportunity to sort of act as a mask on top of what we're working on, or as something that's sort of colonizing or entering and exiting. And so that already had a lot of richness to it, as well as just the content itself. So there was a lot to explore there, but there was also just a sort of spontaneity, sort of creating instantaneous offerings of hearing things for the first time or responding to your scene partner for the first time, as well as going away and chipping away at the meaning and chipping away at the potential meaning or underlying meanings, and that relationship between an intellectual knowing and then a more instinctual knowing, and deciding which one was going to override the other. And depending on the dancer or the scene, it sometimes would be something more spontaneous, and other times would be something that would be more crafted.
It was kind of, we began the rehearsals with these, not polished, but a performance already kind of finished. Mm-hmm. We had some room to edit, the timings of the various takes we had chosen in the farce track. But these guys started rehearsals trying to catch up with a performance that already felt like it was, show ready. So it was interesting to watch these guys, because at first it was them trying to keep up to the characterization and all the vocal choices that had been made. But by where we got to, like a year later, it felt like there was so much freedom inside those sounds, and that these guys were leading the voices, or that the voices were coming from them. The physical choices were leading the voices. Yeah.
Well, that's so interesting, because as I was watching it, I was thinking about how the dancers are lip syncing, and that timing then has to be absolutely perfect. And so then the timing of the movements that you're doing to characterize those words and the spaces in between the words also have to be so perfect. So on the one hand, there's this limitation. On the other hand, the fact that you are not actually using your breath and your voice would seem to give you a lot more freedom in how you're able to move, because the choreography doesn't have to be adapted around your breath in the same way. Like, how did that all, like, what does that feel like? And what is that like to perform in that way?
It's hard.
Yeah. I mean, when we started, not all of us lip synced right away. Mm-hmm. So we all had a different process there. I think some of us were really, found that there was a lot to get out of really feeling like, I mean, because I have John's voice, like I could just even feel that the whole shape of my mouth had to act differently, and the whole idea of a mask, even before I received a beard, came with just trying to make the same shapes in my mouth in the way that I felt like his voice was speaking, and so it's already really physical. Just the act of lip syncing is already informing the body, but there was also the ability to just take on the inflection or the sound in the body, and sort of realizing what the percussive consonants are like versus some more emotional vowels in the body and how they move. So there was,
the lip syncing aspect is very connected to the mind, it seems like, and that action seems to be very connected to the intellectual, the thought process of the character. But yeah, when you get using it as a score, would open up all sorts of other ways to express or tactics, and
less as an exposition or something literal, and more as intuitive, or a deeper knowing, or a type of sort of foreshadowing that would happen. I mean, that's the experience of performing it now, is that you're just seeing into maybe what happened before the audience arrived, or you're seeing into the layers of the show within the show within the show. And so you're having all of these moments, especially because I feel like my character has multiple mistaken identities. And so I can feel all of those layers kind of talking at different moments. So from show to show, different lines have a different weightiness to it. On some nights, things that are hilarious become really poignant the next night. And then there's this beautiful opportunity to play with your scene partners, because however set and choreographed and even tyrannical the whole thing feels, there's this opportunity to, especially with the nature of the revisor, to twist it or improvise or create a new offering in the moment.
Come at it
yeah,
from a different direction.
That sort of, tricks my scene partner or my own self into thinking challenging what I think I know is happening to me in the moment.
It's so fascinating to hear you say that, because the last thing I would have guessed was that there was any artistic freedom in the moment in performing this piece. So that's really amazing. That, and combined with, I'm also just amazed by the coordination that each of you dancers has to add in mouth movements to full-on body movements when you're not accustomed to using your mouth in that way, and so precise. And then what you're saying, that the mouth movements have to be believable. Like, you can't just move your lips, you have to mouth the actual vocal sounds.
And to some extent know why you're saying what you're saying, and when and to whom. Like that's a whole bunch of thinking that gets in the way of pure movement. Mm-hmm. But then ultimately, over time, they end up complementing each other. And
it boggles the mind. So Jonathon, you are the voice of the revisor, and Tiffany, you are the body. So was there a collaborative aspect for you guys together to bring that to life?
The interesting thing about the revisor is, or Kiestikov in Gogol's play, not, because I can't take credit for the character, but that he is a chameleon and adjusts to each situation that she is in. And so I was figuring out as much as Tiff was in the moment who this character was and why they made their decisions when. Like, it was as much a mystery to me. Mm-hmm. So I think we were kind of figuring it out together.
I mean, I do feel like I'm building on the years of performing and traveling together for Betroffenheit. And I felt like I definitely had an edge in terms of knowing John's voice and already having embodied John's voice in a very different context for Betroffenheit. So there was so much knowledge to build on there. At the same time, the character is sort of learning what's happening at the same rate almost as the audience. And so in that way, I felt like I was allowed to be a couple steps behind in certain places, but I had to be many steps ahead in other places. So it became a lot about checking in with John about whether I needed to play the problem or play the solution, or where are my turning points. And then at any moment that I was at a loss, there was John sort of being himself, and I could steal from his body language. Or
I sort of caught her watching me all the time in the rehearsal room when I was just, refilling my coffee or something.
Yeah.
Did the other dancers and voiceover actors have any sort of connection in the same way?
Barely. The two casts did eventually meet, but not until you guys were well into the process, and that physical characterization had already, become its own thing. It was pretty fun the day the voice actors came in to watch themselves in the show that they were in. Mm-hmm. It was, I think, quite a trip for those guys.
And for us to see the face.
Exactly, to finally see the human behind the voice. Yeah.
And is there a reason to use voiceover actors rather than stage actors? Like, what is it about voice actors?
They are stage actors. It was a mix of people, I would certainly not consider myself a voiceover actor. And I think we had two in the cast that primarily make their living doing voice acting and were technically incredible to work with, but all the others do both.
And was there any way that they adapted their phrasing or the tempo of their speech to make it danceable, or was it literally determined by the proper cadence of the speech that you wanted?
It was something I consider, the musicality was something I considered throughout the whole writing process, and it's definitely something that Crystal and I considered in the recording studio, was just listening for a take that felt like it would be great to move to.
Interesting. So then we come to that second half where there's that deconstructed sort of meta thing, and I was reading a couple
internal inspection, that's what I like to call it.
The what?
The internal inspection.
So tell me about that, because I've read a couple of London reviewers, one of whom completely got it and said, I want to see this over and over again. And another one who was like, after the dialogue part, really didn't understand. And I wonder what was the inspiration behind that? Why did you take it in that direction?
It certainly wants to walk the line between comprehension and total disorientation. And in Gogol's play, at that point when the revisor is given evidence by the officials, he gradually comes to understand kind of the horrors of what's actually going on here, the cruelty and the violence, the corruption. And he is, of course, given bribes, and then he decides to write his letter to expose them all. And we wondered if the inspector was already embedded within this image language system, was already here, was present as a voice, but not physically on stage, and was somehow connected to the entire thing. What evidence would she be examining, and what would she draw up from the depths? Like I said before about the farce or the vocal tract being sort of existing on the surface, we always imagined that inspection going into the depths of it. And when writing it, I always tried to put myself in the inspector's POV, looking at these guys rehearsing, looking at the stage, and trying to inspect the movement and the language for something that was already there, but that I had overlooked. Does that answer your question in any way?
Absolutely, yeah.
What do I think?
Yeah.
About why there's that other section?
Yeah, the inspection.
The inspection. Can't say about Gogol's play, but at the heart of our work, the idea of the farce being a mask or something that has sort of taken over the body, and that there's this conflict or an even question of like what's underneath the farce. There's a lot of talk about the center or even the vast unknowable region. And so there's this territory that you can't quite put your finger on, that you can't access, but or that is only mentioned but not visited.
There's also the movement, which the director insists is dead.
Mm-hmm. And there's also
the talk that he is searching for. Right?
And the truth that has a shape that cannot be contained. And so I feel like the text is constantly trying to send us down this avenue of the abstract and the unknown. And you know, when it comes at this point in time where my character is given all of this terrifying, horrendous information, it seems like that is the place where to really take it in, we want to not be intellectualizing necessarily. We want to be in a place of sort of in a more, I don't know, vulnerable place, and going into a world where it's less intellectualized and less about language and more abstracted and about movement. Just seems to make sense for all of those references, seeds that had been planted in the earlier part. And certainly as dancers, we had felt very propelled by the language, but at all times could feel this potential, if there was more time, more space, with our scene partner, with that word, with that movement, to really sit in the richness that each of those things had, as opposed to just feel like you're being chased by it, or that you're chasing it yourself. So it was definitely an urge that satisfies a lot of things as a performer too.
Well, as a dance person, I felt a sense of relief almost when it became a more abstract, just movement-based section, and partly because the movement itself is so beautiful, so exquisite and intriguing. It was a pleasure. It was a dark mirror. It was not a happy place, but it was really quite an extraordinary place. Was there, for you, Tiffany, a different feeling in performing in that way versus in the first part that's so anchored to words? Do you move differently?
Absolutely. There's I mean, I think there's the way it was choreographed that I'm sort of sent there by what I think is a quite hilarious massage moment by the character D'Souza. So her character says, the truth has a shape that cannot be contained, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. And then she's encouraging me to go deeper and go deeper and go deeper, and then I'm given all this information. And so
it's kind of through the body, through loosening up the revisor,
exactly.
we kind of enter that portal.
Yeah, and so I feel like there's this beginning of sort of breaking down a rigidity that comes with the language in the first half, and so certainly I feel that. I feel like I'm turned to a mush that is sort of like vulnerable and now stirred around by the group. And within that idea that the truth is sort of slipping through my fingers, it's not really, I'm trying to congeal it, I'm trying to make sense of it.
And it's somewhere between voice and body.
Yeah, and between me and other characters, and there's this confusion of, are we even separate subjects anymore? Are we separate from the language, from each other, from the sort of scene?
And how does the subject inspect itself?
Exactly.
That's what the territory starts to get into.
Yeah, and so there's a soupiness in the body, or like almost like a marshland or something. It feels like we're in the vast unknowable region, and things aren't as concrete, and it feels really different in the body. It feels like a chance to connect on a really physical, a deep physical sensorial level with the rest of the performers. And even with the couch and with the desk, everything is, you can sort of feel everything more deeply. And then I also get to experience the layers of my mask coming off gradually. So I am sort of disrobed, and then there's that turning point where it all comes back on. And so the chance to sort of feel the blurring and decaying and pieces being taken off, and a sense of revealing over time makes for a really dramatic turning point, to have it all come rushing back with a sense of, I know what I need to do now.
So it's scripted and it's directed, but what you're talking about is and throughout this conversation is very personal, almost in the moment sometimes interpretation of the work. So as during the creation process, was your input part of it? I mean, did Crystal give you movement prompts and you created together, or was she deciding, I want you to do this here and this there?
Yeah, with Crystal, all things are on the table, all ways of creating. Crystal just has that capacity as a creator to trust you completely, let you do your thing, or to make the whole thing, to move every hair, every muscle. And so it really depend on the moment, it depend on the time, depend on the scene or the amount of work we had to do. So it was really, I think, all the different ways you could imagine something being made in terms of the transactions and the roles that were played, probably all of those happened. But there's also the ability to continue to create it within each performance. And certainly in that way, that sort of starts at the beginning. Crystal's way of trusting everybody, selecting people who she knows are going to recognize areas to create offerings that she's leaving blank purposefully, or that she didn't even know were there to insert. That sort of, that's by virtue of the way that she leads. And both John and Crystal bring such a wealth of material and richness right from the very beginning that you can go for hours without getting new information from them and still feel like there's more to work on. So their direction and their touch is always there, even if you're not in a creative, immediate transaction.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Jonathon, your script, I noticed, especially in that second half, there's so much wonderful verbal, visual puns, like the subject is moved, the subject comes to light, we were sent for versus we were sent. I mean, just there's so many layers in this piece. And I really would love to hear about your approach as a playwright to this material and creating such a complex piece.
Geez. Yeah, I guess my approach or my process is always to try and open as many doors as I can without leading the viewer to some solution. I much prefer asking questions that I don't know how to answer. And since working with Crystal and the Kid Pivot dancers, like I said earlier, it always seems to me that the language is reaching towards a territory where it has no agency or authority, where it's into a territory where the body takes over. And so, yeah, the double meanings seem to me to be clues to the spectator that something else is going on here under the language or in conjunction with the language. And it was interesting to try to do that through farce and through the ridiculousness of some of the humor, but knowing all the while we wanted to get to something that was personal and dark and unsolvable. And that's, I think, as much as I can say about my process. It seems to change every time.
Well, the whole thing is a bit like creating poetry, right? You have specific words, but they come together in ways that you can't quite put your finger on, and they come together as greater than the sum of a sentence. So
yeah, and we were, the big problem we struggled with, the interesting problem, the problem we set out to try and grapple with was, where is the inspector? Who is the inspector? What is her relationship to this complex? Are we inside her? Is she a figure on the stage? Is she all the figures on the stage? And that kept us busy for months. And that question, I think, still hangs in the air. Yeah. Where is she? What is she? Who is she?
Well, I do think that you accomplished the asking of questions that I think people who come and watch the piece will ponder. I mean, there's so much food for thought in this work in so many different ways. Just trying to parse it it's really very rich material. And finally, is there anything that either or both of you learned from creating or performing this piece that you'll carry with you moving forward?
I learned that I want to keep working with dancers.
How about you, Tiffany?
I mean, yeah, I would say that what I felt I was able to learn through working with text opened up a lot of territory that feels like we could spend, it's unending opportunity there.
We kept talking about the different ways you could come at it.
Oh,
yeah. And that seems like just food for thought for the next project.
And even just the experience of recorded text, and how, as you've been touching on, how sort of set it feels. With each performance, is only more and more opportunity and space is opening up, and in that way, I still feel really greedy for opportunities to perform it.
I have to say, I learned a lot about acting working with these guys too, being on the outside and watching them move into a performance to fill a performance with life. I thought I learned. It was quite fascinating to watch that happen.
And I feel overwhelmed by the question, because I learned so much every day in the process, watching how everyone was coming at it from a different angle, and how the show was able to hold all of those different voices and different approaches, and
how frustrating
desires.
It could be, and then how delightful.
Well, yeah,
right?
And also from my character's perspective of not knowing, but also having a pursuit. So constantly in a state of learning what is happening, and then also trying to develop an agenda in the moment is an incredible exercise as a performer. And to, at the beginning of the process, to relinquish the idea of being ready as a as a contributor to the, when you just really want your offerings to be so ready and wonderful for everybody, and then to realize that that wasn't going to be so possible because there's so much new territory and everything was happening quite quickly. So that was an incredible thing to learn too, is that actually my character is supposed to be improvising.
Yeah, it's totally unprepared.
It's totally unprepared. That is what being ready is. Like that, when I'm in my element, it unlocks a creative intelligence. And it's something that was sort of like a trick I told myself that, okay, the character needs this as a way to sort of keep my confidence up as I was just making offerings on the fly and not even knowing if they were what the work needed. And then when that became the mode of being, now I feel like I hope to carry that with me in the beginning of every process, where my whole concept of what being ready to make an offering has been sort of reshaped.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation, and congratulations again on your beautiful work.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Come, why don't you tell us about yourself? What are your interests? What are you looking into these days?
At the moment, an empty glass.
Go on.